Some true stories shatter everything we thought we knew about the past. They're so extraordinary they feel like fiction, until you discover they're real. Imagine war-torn 16th century Japan, a time of clashing steel, rigid social codes, and the warrior culture of the samurai. Now picture a man whose very presence broke every rule of this isolated nation. Standing around 6 feet tall, a black African warrior who would rise from the chains of slavery to become a samurai. This is the story of Yasuke, a man history nearly erased. To understand how remarkable Yasuke's story is, we need to understand the world he entered. Late 16th century Japan was in the heart of the Sengoku period, the age of warring states. For over a century, the country had been torn apart by civil war. Powerful warlords called daimyo commanded vast armies of samurai, each fighting to control Japan's future. On the surface, society appeared rigid. You were born into your station and expected to die in it. At the top sat the emperor, revered as divine but wielding no real power. Below him was the shogun, a military dictator whose authority had crumbled, which is precisely what sparked the chaos. And then there was the warrior class, the samurai. We often imagine samurai bound by a strict universal code of honor, but the formalized code we call Bushido was largely a later creation from the more peaceful Edo period. Sengoku-era samurai were pragmatic fighters, and their loyalty belonged more to their ambitious lords than to abstract ideals. While the social hierarchy was steep, constant warfare created opportunities. It wasn't unheard of for a commoner to rise through sheer skill in battle. This was a nation of breathtaking contradictions, exquisite art alongside brutal warfare, profound philosophy mixed with deep social anxiety. And into this fiercely proud, insular world a ship was approaching, carrying a man who would challenge everything Japan thought it knew about itself. By the 1570s, Japan wasn't as isolated as we might imagine. Portuguese traders had arrived decades earlier, bringing firearms, Christianity, and a vast trading network that stretched from Lisbon to Goa to Macau. In 1571, they established Nagasaki as a dedicated trading port. These weren't just merchants, they were the leading edge of European colonialism in Asia, and with them came Jesuit missionaries determined to convert Japan to Christianity. The Portuguese operated a brutal system. Their ships carried not only silk and spices, but enslaved people from their African colonies, Mozambique, Angola, and the East African coast. These men and women were trafficked to India, China, and Japan, where they served Portuguese merchants and priests as everything from labourers to bodyguards. It was within this network of exploitation and ambition that our story begins. In 1579, a ship carrying Jesuit missionaries from Europe arrived at a Japanese port. On board was Alessandro Valignano, a high-ranking Italian priest on an inspection tour of Jesuit missions in Asia. By his side stood his bodyguard and attendant, a tall, powerfully built African man. We don't know his birth name or his exact origins. Historical accounts suggest he may have come from Portuguese Mozambique, Ethiopia, or the region of modern-day South Sudan. What we do know is that he had been enslaved, trafficked to India, and eventually entered Valignano's service, an unfree man travelling to the edge of the known world. When they arrived in Kyoto, the capital, in 1581, chaos erupted. The Japanese had never seen a black man before. Crowds swarmed them, a human wave of shock and curiosity, pushing and shoving for a glimpse of this giant with dark skin. Jesuit records describe the frenzy as so intense that people were crushed in the stampede. His height alone was astonishing. At around 6 feet tall, he towered over the average Japanese man of the time, who stood closer to 5 feet. The commotion eventually reached the ears of the most powerful man in Japan, the warlord on the verge of conquering the entire country, Oda Nobunaga. Intrigued by reports of a giant causing riots simply by walking down the street, he summoned the man to his castle. Oda Nobunaga was no ordinary daimyo. He was brilliant, ruthless, and insatiably curious. He embraced new technologies, especially the Portuguese firearms that were revolutionizing warfare, and he was fascinated by the world beyond Japan's shores. He was also notorious for his violent temper and his willingness to break with tradition. When the tall African man was brought before him, Nobunaga was stunned. Convinced the man's skin must be painted with black ink, he ordered one of the strangest tests in Japanese history. Servants were commanded to strip and scrub the man's skin. They washed him thoroughly, but the colour wouldn't fade. If anything, it seemed richer and deeper. Finally convinced, Nobunaga's suspicion transformed into fascination. He was captivated by the man's physical strength and his calm, dignified bearing. Chronicles record that Nobunaga declared he possessed the might of 10 men. This was the turning point. Where others saw a slave or a curiosity, Nobunaga saw a warrior. He asked Valignano to leave the man in his service. The priest agreed. Nobunaga gave him a new Japanese name, Yasuke. What happened next was unprecedented. Yasuke wasn't relegated to the role of servant or curiosity. He was elevated to a position almost entirely reserved for the Japanese elite. While modern scholars debate the precise technicalities of his official title, the practical reality is clear. Yasuke was granted the privileges and responsibilities of a samurai. This wasn't ceremonial. Yasuke received his own residence, a regular stipend, and most significantly the right to wear 2 swords, the katana and the wakizashi. These blades were considered the soul of the samurai. He became the first recorded non-Japanese person to be granted this status. Nobunaga brought Yasuke into his inner circle. He served as the warlord's personal weapon bearer and bodyguard, a position of profound trust. Historical accounts indicate Yasuke was permitted to dine with Nobunaga, a privilege extended to very few. The once enslaved man from Africa had become a confidant to the most powerful leader in Japan. He learned Japanese, adapted to the culture, and though some in Nobunaga's court view this outsider's rise with suspicion, Yasuke's loyalty belonged to the one man who'd given him a new life. Yasuke was no ornament. He was a warrior, and Nobunaga intended to use his skills. Yasuke became a member of Nobunaga's retinue and accompanied him on military campaigns. He was present following the decisive victory over the Takeda clan, one of Nobunaga's most formidable rivals. While detailed accounts of him fighting in specific pitched battles are scarce in the historical record, he was recognized as a legitimate warrior in the service of Japan's great unifier. Picture it, a black samurai in Japanese armor, wielding a katana, fighting for the unification of Japan. It sounds impossible, a scene from an adventure film, but it was real. For a brief, brilliant period between 1581 and 1582, Yasuke lived the impossible. He had transcended his past, shattered the class barriers of a foreign land, and earned his place through strength and loyalty. But the Sengoku period was an age of betrayal, and the world Nobunaga had built was about to collapse. In June of 1582, Oda Nobunaga was staying at Honnoji, a temple in Kyoto, preparing to lead his army westward. He was accompanied by only a small group of attendants and bodyguards, including Yasuke. One of Nobunaga's most trusted generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, saw an opportunity. In a shocking act of treachery that would alter Japanese history, Mitsuhide turned his 13,000-man army against the temple. Nobunaga and his small band of followers, Yasuke among them, were trapped. They fought desperately against impossible odds as flames consumed the temple around them. With no hope of escape, Oda Nobunaga committed seppuku, the ritual suicide of a samurai, rather than face capture. Yasuke fought to the very end to protect his lord. Before we discover what happened to Yasuke after this devastating betrayal and explore the mystery of his final years, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss our next journey into history's hidden corners. In the chaos following Nobunaga's death, Yasuke escaped the burning temple and rushed to join Nobunaga's son and heir, Oda Nobutada, who was stationed at Nijo Castle nearby. But their resistance was hopeless. Soon they too were overwhelmed by Akechi's forces. Yasuke fought until he was finally captured and brought before the traitor Akechi Mitsuhide. Mitsuhide didn't execute him. According to Jesuit accounts, Akechi dismissed Yasuke, declaring that he was an animal and not Japanese, and therefore didn't understand honor, so he shouldn't be required to die like a samurai. This statement, almost certainly intended as a profound insult, is what saved his life. Akechi ordered him returned to the Jesuit church. The missionaries, for their part, gave thanks for his survival. And here, in late 1582, the historical record falls silent. The story of Yasuke, the black samurai, simply vanishes. We have no record of what happened to him. Did he remain in Japan with the missionaries? Did he eventually sail back to India or somehow return to Africa? His ultimate fate remains one of history's unsolved mysteries. Yasuke's story becomes even more remarkable when we understand he wasn't the only foreigner in 16th century Japan. Portuguese traders, Spanish merchants, Dutch sailors, and Jesuit missionaries from across Europe all moved through Japan's ports. Some even served Japanese lords in various capacities, as gunners, advisors, or translators. But none achieved what Yasuke did. None were granted samurai status. None were brought into the inner circle of Japan's most powerful warlord. Other foreigners remained in their roles as merchants, priests, or specialists. Yasuke alone crossed the boundary that separated outsider from insider, foreigner from warrior. His rise wasn't just unusual, it was completely unique. For centuries, Yasuke's story was buried. Brief mentions existed in Jesuit letters and Japanese chronicles, but they were scattered fragments, easily overlooked. In Japan's collective memory, he all but disappeared. The country that had witnessed his remarkable journey seemed to forget he had ever existed. It wasn't until the late 20th century that scholars began piecing together his story. In 1968, historian François Solier wrote about Yasuke in a French journal. In the 1990s, Japanese historians started examining the scattered historical records with fresh eyes. Children's books appeared in Japan. Academic papers followed. Slowly, painstakingly, Yasuke was brought back from the edge of oblivion. By the 2010s and 2020s, his story exploded into popular consciousness. Novels, films, anime, and video games embraced his legend. What had been forgotten was now celebrated. Yasuke had become a symbol of resilience, of the complexity of history, of stories that refuse to stay buried. The story of Yasuke is far more than a historical curiosity. It's the story of a man stolen from his home, stripped of his name and his freedom, and dragged halfway across the world, only to rise to one of the most honoured positions in a society famous for its resistance to outsiders. He shattered every expectation of race, class, and culture in 16th century Japan. His story challenges us to reconsider what we think we know about the past. History isn't a collection of neat, separate narratives. It's messy, interconnected, and full of people who defied every limitation placed on them. Yasuke's journey from a nameless enslaved man to a respected samurai reminds us that even when the historical record falls silent, some legends are too powerful to forget. The world tried to erase Yasuke, but his story survived, and it demands to be told. What do you think happened to Yasuke after 1582? Let us know in the comments below.